Hello everyone, and welcome back to Altrole's Class Breakdown series. I'm Bill, admin and instructor for Altrole, and today we're going to continue our Class Breakdown series to give you a general overview of all the classes in D&D 5th edition to help you find the one that you want to play. Today, let's examine the Cleric, devoted intermediaries of the gods that not only seek to worship their deity, but embody their teachings with their actions. Clerics act as conduits for godly powers on the mortal plane, specifically chosen by their deity to fulfill this higher calling. This calling leads them to travel as adventurers, moving throughout the land spreading the word of their god, protecting fellow worshippers, and smiting evil from the land. Now, a cleric is not just any old priest. In fact, characters don't have to be involved with their region's clergy at all to be a cleric. All you have to do is believe in your devotion to your god. Being chosen by a god comes with its own boons, as clerics can wield godlike magical powers through their devotion that grants them some of the best healing abilities and spells in D&D. Alongside this divine magic is a surprising amount of martial trading as well, with clerics being as handy with a mace as they are with a spellcasting focus. With these aspects in mind, the cleric is typically reserved for a support role in the party, but can be effective as a tank, utility caster, and ranged or melee damage dealer, depending on how they're built. To help summarize the cleric and clarify its role, let's go through a quick pros and cons list that I've organized into 3 main points for each. Starting with the pros, the first is that the cleric has great support options. Through their varied healing and support spells, supplemented by specialized healing and buffing subclass abilities, the cleric can actually be the best healer in Dungeons & Dragons, both at early levels and in the late game. The second main pro of the cleric is that they are very tanky. Despite being so caster-focused, the cleric is surprisingly hard to kill, starting with light and medium armor proficiencies, shield proficiency, a d8 as their hit dice, and defensive warding spells, all supplemented by their ability to heal any damage that gets through. The last main positive of the cleric is that, ultimately, they are versatile. As stated before, the cleric can do almost everything moderately well, depending on how they're built and what subclasses are chosen. Since they get their subclasses at level 1, and their casting is relatively forgiving, it's easy to see that the cleric can be molded into any major role that the party needs filled. With these pros in mind, the cleric looks like an unkillable healer that can do just about anything. However, there are some negatives to the class we need to discuss, the first of which being that the cleric is slow. While this can be offset by certain subclass abilities, the cleric doesn't gain many options to increase their speed or mobility with their base class abilities or spell options. Couple that with a racial choice that has a movement speed slower than 30 feet, and the cleric will have trouble catching up to their foes on the battlefield. The second main negative of the cleric is that they are multiple ability dependent. Due to their versatility between casting, tanking, and martial damage, the cleric relies on having their wisdom, constitution, and strength or dexterity be as high as they can get, meaning the cleric takes longer than other classes to get to their optimal build. Finally, the third main negative of the cleric is that they are complicated. The abundance of choice the cleric provides, especially at early levels, is often paired with the confusion it can bring to new players. While not as complicated as other classes, cleric players still need to understand what they want the character to do before specializing into these responsibilities, which can be daunting to new players that are still learning the game. With the overview laid out and the pros and cons analyzed, let's next review the unique class abilities that the cleric earns as they level up. Starting at level 1, the cleric gains their spellcasting and chooses a divine domain. The cleric is a wisdom caster, meaning their spell attack modifier and spell save DC are both affected by their wisdom score. The cleric starts with 3 cantrips known and 2 first level spell slots. They gain higher level spell slots every odd level, gaining second level slots at level 3, third level slots at level 5, fourth level slots at level 7, fifth level slots at level 9, sixth level slots at level 11, seventh level slots at level 13, eighth level slots at level 15, and ninth level slots at level 17. Spent spell slots are regained upon finishing a long rest. Before they can cast any of these spells, the cleric must prepare them. They can prepare a number of spells equal to their wisdom modifier plus their cleric level, and the spells must be a level which the cleric has spell slots for. Prepared spells can be changed after finishing a long rest through prayer and meditation. Divine Domains, on the other hand, are the cleric's subclass options that determine what the cleric's deity is a god or goddess of. The cleric gains new Divine Domain features at levels 6, 8, and 17. We'll discuss these in more detail later in the video. At level 2, the cleric gains the Channel Divinity ability, which grants 2 effects the cleric can use once per short or long rest: Turn Undead, and 1 effect determined by their Divine Domain. Turn Undead allows the cleric to produce their holy symbol and force a wisdom saving throw from any undead within 30 feet, turning the creatures for 1 minute or until they take damage if they fail. While turned, the creatures must move as far away from the cleric as they can, can't take reactions, and can only dash or dodge if not restricted. At level 6, Channel Divinity can be used twice between rests, and at level 18, it can be used 3 times between rests. At level 4, the cleric gains their first ability score improvement. Ability score improvements add +2 to 1 ability score, or +1 to 2 ability scores, up to the soft cap of 20. Clerics gain 5 ability score increases as they level up, and if the DM is using the optional feats rule, you can forego an ability score improvement to take a feat instead. At level 5, the cleric gains the Destroy Undead ability, which states when an undead creature below a certain challenge rating fails the cleric's Turn Undead saving throw, the creature is instantly destroyed. The challenge rating limit starts at 1/2 CR or lower at level 5, and increases to 1 CR or lower at level 8, 2 CR or lower at level 11, 3 CR or lower at level 14, and 4 CR or lower at level 17. Now, finally, at level 10, the cleric gains the Divine Intervention ability, which states that the cleric can ask their deity for assistance as an action. The cleric then rolls a D100, and if the number rolled is equal to or lower than the cleric's level, their deity will intervene with an effect that the dungeon master chooses. If the deity intervenes, this ability can't be used for another 7 days. If they do not intervene, this ability can be used again after finishing a long rest. This ability gets better at level 20, where it will automatically succeed whenever it is used. With these base abilities, we can see that the cleric does have some unique abilities to use outside of their spellcasting, but these are mostly reserved for fighting undead creatures. Thus, the usefulness of abilities like Turn Undead and Destroy Undead will depend on whether or not the party is going to be fighting a lot of undead. Next up, let's look at the Divine Domains the cleric can choose from to establish what aspect of life their deity has influence over. There are 14 Divine Domains available to choose from at level 1. Alongside their unique abilities, each domain grants a set of domain spells that are gained at certain levels in the subclass, are always prepared, and don't count against the number of spells the cleric can prepare each day. Now, I'm going to go through the Divine Domains in alphabetical order, but as always, if you want to skip ahead to a subclass you want to know more about, you can use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead to the one that you're interested in. Gods of the Arcana Domain have an innate knowledge of magic, often associated with the learning and preservation of magical knowledge. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Detect Magic and Magic Missile spells, as well as the Arcane Initiate ability. Arcane Initiate grants proficiency in the Arcana skill and 2 cantrips from the Wizard spell list, counting them as Cleric cantrips. Further levels in this subclass grant the Arcane Abjuration Channel Divinity ability to turn Celestials, Elementals, Fae, and Fiends if they fail a Wisdom saving throw, the ability to banish turned creatures with this Channel Divinity option based on their challenge rating, the ability to end a spell effect on a creature that gets healed by the Cleric, the ability to add their Wisdom modifier to damage rolls for Cleric cantrips, and eventually the ability to choose 1/6, 1/7, 1/8, and 1/9 level Wizard spell, and add them to the Cleric's list of domain spells. The Arcana Domain borrows heavily from the Wizard in its theme and spells, while still providing some good support, control, and even some varied damage options. For a player who's having trouble deciding between playing a Wizard or a Cleric, the Arcana Domain gives you enough of both in a powerful subclass to remain fun and functional in the party. Gods of the Death Domain focus on the negative energy that gives rise to the undead, typically embodying areas of worship such as murder, pain, disease, poison, and the underworld. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the False Life and Ray of Sickness spells, proficiency with martial weapons, and the Reaper ability. Reaper grants the Cleric 1 Necromancy cantrip from any spell list, and grants the ability to cause a cantrip that normally targets only 1 creature to instead target 2 creatures within range and within 5 feet of each other. Further levels in this subclass grant the Touch of Death Channel Divinity option that deals extra necrotic damage on melee attacks, the ability for necrotic damage from the Cleric to ignore resistances, the ability to infuse the Cleric's weapon attacks with necrotic damage, and eventually the ability to target 2 creatures within 5 feet of each other instead of 1 when casting a necromancy spell of 1st through 5th level. While originally intended for DMs to use as an NPC class, the Death Domain Cleric operates as a great offensive-focused character. With the Cleric's innate healing and tankiness, and this subclass's added necrotic damage on weapon attacks that can ignore resistances, the Death Domain Cleric is a beast of a choice for players that want to play a more damage-focused Cleric with support options in reserve. Gods of the Forge Domain focus on the strenuous work of craftsmanship, being the patron deities for artisans, miners, and other working-class folk. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Identify and Searing Smite spells, proficiency with heavy armor and smith's tools, and the Blessing of the Forge ability. Blessing of the Forge states that after finishing a long rest, the Cleric can touch 1 non-magical suit of armor or weapon, turning it into a magic item that either grants a +1 to armor class to armor, or a +1 to attack and damage rolls to weapons. Further levels in this subclass grant the Artisan's Blessing Channel Divinity option that just creates 1 non-magical item, resistance to fire damage, a +1 bonus to the Cleric's armor class when wearing heavy armor, the ability to infuse the Cleric's weapon attacks with fire damage, and eventually grants the Cleric full immunity to fire damage and resistance to non-magical slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing damage when wearing heavy armor. The Forge Domain is a tanky, melee subclass option, focusing on buffing up their armor class and resistances through innate abilities, while retaining a lot of good damage options within their spell list. If the party needs a defender that can still dish out good damage, the Forge Domain is an excellent choice. Gods of the Grave Domain are responsible for the afterlife, watching over the dead to ensure they pass on properly and imbuing their worshippers with the reminder that death always gets its due. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Bane and False Life spells, the Circle of Mortality ability, and the Eyes of the Grave ability. Circle of Mortality grants the Cleric a buffed version of the Spare the Dying cantrip that has a range of 30 feet and a casting time of a bonus action, as well as allowing the Cleric to use the highest possible dice numbers when rolling to heal a creature that's at 0 hit points. Eyes of the Dead allows the Cleric to sense the presence of undead within 60 feet, so long as they aren't behind total cover or protected by divination magic. This can be used a number of times equal to the Cleric's Wisdom modifier. Further levels in this subclass grant the Path to the Grave Channel Divinity option that marks a creature with vulnerability against the next attack taken, the ability to turn critical hits against themselves or allies within 30 feet into normal hits, the ability to add their Wisdom modifier to the damage rolls of Cleric cantrips, and eventually the ability to have themselves or a nearby ally regain health when a nearby enemy dies. The Grave Domain Cleric strikes a balance between healing support and offensive spellcasting, using both to keep the party alive and to keep the pressure on for their opponents. If the Cleric's base role as a healer appeals to you, but you want to be able to do more damage, the Grave Domain Cleric will probably be a lot of fun for you. Gods of the Knowledge Domain value teaching and understanding, pushing their followers to collect more knowledge and unlock the secrets of the universe. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Command and Identify spells, as well as the Blessings of Knowledge ability. Blessings of Knowledge grants 2 languages, proficiency in 2 skills from a selection of Arcana, History, Nature, and Religion, and the Cleric's proficiency bonus is doubled for any rolls for those chosen 2 skill checks. Further levels in this subclass grant the Knowledge of the Ages Channel Divinity option that grants temporary proficiency with a skill or tool, the ability to read a creature's surface level thoughts if it fails a Wisdom saving throw, the ability to cast the Suggestion spell on a creature that failed the Mind reading saving throw without using a spell slot, the ability to add their Wisdom modifier to the damage rolls of Cleric cantrips, and eventually, the ability to call up visions of the past to see visions of an object or an area's past actions. The Knowledge Domain Cleric is a more niche subclass, focusing their spells and abilities more on information gathering than practical combat applications. As such, your enjoyment of this subclass is going to depend on whether the campaign you're in has enough roleplay and story elements to make the Knowledge Cleric's info gathering worth giving up a combat role in the party. Gods of the Life Domain focus on the positive energy that sustains living creatures, promoting care of the sick and wounded, and driving away forces of death and undeath. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Bless and Cure Wounds spells, proficiency with heavy armor, and the Disciple of Life ability. With Disciple of Life, anytime the Cleric uses a first level spell or higher to restore hit points, the creature gains additional hit points equal to 2 plus the spell's level. Further levels in this subclass grant the Preserve Life Channel Divinity option that gives the Cleric a pool of hit points to split between creatures within range, the ability to regain health when casting healing spells on others, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra radiant damage, and eventually gains the ability to always use the highest dice number possible when rolling to heal a creature with a spell. The Life Domain Cleric is the single best healer in all of D&D, coming to the table with immense support options to heal and remove status effects through their spellcasting that is further buffed from their abilities. However, with access to heavy armor and extra radiant damage on weapon attacks, they can actually support the party from the front line rather than being stuck in the back with the wizard. So, if you want the best healer that you can get, all wrapped up in a nice defensive package, the Life Domain is the greatest choice that you can make. Gods of the Light Domain are sentinels of the sun who promote the ideals of rebirth, truth, vigilance, and beauty, and charge their worshippers to drive away lies and darkness in the world. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Burning Hands and Fairy Fire spells, the Light cantrip, and the Warding Flare ability. Warding Flare lets the Cleric use their reaction when attacked to impose disadvantage on the enemy's attack a number of times equal to their Wisdom modifier. Further levels in this subclass grant the Radiance of the Dawn Channel Divinity option that dispels darkness and deals radiant damage to nearby enemies, the ability to use Warding Flare on enemies attacking nearby allies, the ability to add their Wisdom modifier to the damage rolls of Cleric cantrips, and eventually gain the ability to radiate sunlight, brightening the area and imposing disadvantage on saving throws against spells dealing fire or radiant damage to nearby enemies. The Light Domain Cleric is a great damage-dealing subclass, able to effectively deal radiant and fire damage to either single-target enemies or large groups of weaker enemies. If you want to focus more on killing enemies before they can damage your allies, rather than healing up the damage those enemies would do, the Light Domain is a great ranged spell option that is equally effective in group fights or big boss battles. Gods of the Nature Domain are deities of the forests and groves, who are not only worshipped by druids, but also by clerics who serve as champions that fight those who would despoil the beauty of their god's natural world. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Animal Friendship and Speak with Animals spells, proficiency with Heavy Armor, and the Acolyte of Nature ability. Acolyte of Nature grants one Druid cantrip, as well as proficiency in either Animal Handling, Nature, or Survival. Further levels in this subclass grant the Charm Plants and Animals Channel Divinity option that charms nearby plants and animals if they fail a Wisdom saving throw, grants the ability to grant allies resistance to elemental damage when they take elemental damage, the ability to infuse their weapon attacks with extra cold, fire, or lightning damage, and eventually gain the ability to command plants and animals charmed by the Charm Plants and Animals Channel Divinity option. The Nature Domain Cleric is in a weird spot, having a niche Channel Divinity option and rather lackluster spells, but also having really good support and damage-focused subclass abilities. Since those abilities don't really come until later levels though, and Channel Divinity and subclass spells are really integral to a Cleric's subclass choices, I would recommend players who want a more natural focus to their class to just play a Druid instead of trying to play a Nature Domain Cleric. Gods of the Order Domain represent devotion to discipline, law, and institutions, encouraging their worshippers to establish logical laws and concrete hierarchies that lead the people in protecting the law. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Command and Heroism spells, proficiency with Heavy Armor, proficiency in either Intimidation or Persuasion, and the Voice of Authority ability. Voice of Authority states when the Cleric targets an ally with a first level spell or higher, that ally can use their reaction after the spell effect to make one weapon attack against a creature within range. If a spell targets multiple allies, the Cleric chooses which ally makes the attack. Further levels in this subclass grant the Order's Demand Channel Divinity option that charms nearby creatures that fail a Wisdom saving throw, the ability to cast leveled enchantment spells as a bonus action instead of an action, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra psychic damage, and eventually the ability to curse creatures struck by that extra psychic damage to deal more psychic damage if an ally hits that enemy while they are cursed. The Order Domain Cleric is a great support cleric that tanks with heavy armor while buffing up their allies' attacks, enabling them to attack more and do more damage if focusing down the same target. If you want to play a cleric that emphasizes teamwork while still being able to handle their own, the Order Domain is a good choice to go with. Gods of the Peace Domain preside over the souls of the kind-hearted, sending their worshippers to act as arbitrators, mediators, and shoulders to bear the burdens of others. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Heroism and Sanctuary spells, proficiency in either Insight, Performance, or Persuasion, and the Emboldening Bond ability. Emboldening Bond allows the Cleric to form a bond with a number of creatures equal to their proficiency bonus, allowing the creatures to add a d4 to an attack roll, ability check, or saving throw once per turn. Further levels in this subclass grant the Balm of Peace Channel Divinity option that allows the Cleric to move up to their speed without proccing opportunity attacks and healing creatures within 5 feet of this movement, the ability for bonded creatures to take damage meant for one another by teleporting over to them, the ability for the Cleric to add their Wisdom modifier to the damage rolls of Cleric cantrips, and eventually an increase to the range of Emboldening Bond and granting resistance to the damage an ally is soaking up for another ally when bonded. The Peace Domain Cleric is a very powerful subclass, granting a ton of teamwork abilities that make dice rolls easier, heal the entire party, and allow the party to teleport around the battlefield and soak up damage, while still retaining their spell slots for other utility, healing, or damage options. With the sheer power of their base abilities, and the added power of the Cleric spell list, the Peace Domain Cleric is going to be my personal choice if I want to play a support Cleric that can keep the party at their best while promoting teamwork among them. Gods of the Tempest Domain govern the storms of the sea and sky, presiding over thunder, lightning, and earthquakes while sending their worshippers to remind the common folk to appease these storm gods before venturing into the wilds. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Fog Cloud and Thunderwave spells, proficiency with martial weapons and heavy armor, and the Wrath of the Storm ability. Wrath of the Storm allows the Cleric to use their reaction to force attackers who hit them to make a dexterity saving throw, taking 2d8 thunder or lightning damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a success. This can be used a number of times equal to the Cleric's Wisdom modifier. Further levels in this subclass grant the Destructive Wrath Channel Divinity option that allows the Cleric to deal max damage on any roll dealing thunder or lightning damage, the ability to push large or smaller creatures who are dealt lightning damage up to 10 feet away, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra thunder damage, and eventually the ability to have a flying speed equal to their walking speed when above ground and outdoors. The Tempest Domain Cleric is great as a tank and offensive option, dealing extra damage to enemies who target or are targeted by the Cleric. While any utility or support options are going to have to come from the Cleric's spells rather than their subclass abilities, the Tempest Domain is still a great subclass choice for Clerics who want to channel the Wrath of the Storms on the front lines of combat. Gods of the Trickery Domain are instigators to the natural order of the world, presiding over the actions of thieves, troublemakers, gamblers, and rebels to liberate the world from tradition and spit in the face of tyrants. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Charm Person and Disguise Self spells, as well as the Blessing of the Trickster ability. Blessing of the Trickster allows the Cleric to bless another creature for an hour to grant them advantage on stealth checks. Further levels in this subclass grant the Invoke Duplicity Channel Divinity option that allows the Cleric to create an illusion of themselves and cast spells from the illusion's location, the Cloak of Shadows Channel Divinity option that allows the Cleric to become invisible for 1 turn unless they attack or cast a spell, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra poison damage, and eventually the ability to create up to 4 duplicates with the Invoke Duplicity ability. The Trickery Domain Cleric is a powerful but complex subclass to play, offering a lot of unique options to the class, assuming the player knows what they're doing. However, This subclass can reflavor a cleric to act as a pseudo-rogue for the party, or make an existing rogue even better, and their spells still offer a good amount of utility. All in all, the Trickery Domain is a subclass I would recommend, but only if you're an experienced player who can put their toolkit to good use. Gods of the Twilight Domain guard against the horrors of the night, sending their worshippers to bring comfort to those who seek rest in the encroaching darkness. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Fairy Fire and Sleep spells, proficiency with heavy armor and martial weapons, the Eyes of the Night ability, and the Vigilant Blessing ability. Eyes of the Night grants the Cleric dark vision with a range of 300 feet, and allows them to magically share this dark vision with a number of creatures equal to their Wisdom modifier for 1 hour once per long rest, unless a spell slot is spent to share it again. Vigilant Blessing allows the Cleric to touch a creature and grant them advantage on their next initiative roll. Further levels in this subclass grant the Twilight Sanctuary Channel Divinity option that creates a sphere that can grant temporary hit points or end a charm or frighten effect on a creature, the ability for the Cleric to grant themselves a flying speed equal to their walking speed when in dim light or darkness, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra radiant damage, and eventually allows the sphere from Twilight Sanctuary to grant half cover to allies within it. The Twilight Domain Cleric is primarily a defensive subclass, focusing on buffing and utility options to enable the rest of the party to dish out damage. All in all, the Twilight Domain is relatively simple and would be a good starting subclass for newer players looking to play a good support or utility caster. Gods of the War Domain preside over the fields of honor, chivalry, and destruction, sending their worshippers to fight hard and inspire others to do great deeds in battle. When taking this subclass, the Cleric gains the Divine Favor and Shield of Faith spells, proficiency with martial weapons and heavy armor, and the War Priest ability. War Priest allows the Cleric to attack with a bonus action when they make an attack action, a number of times equal to the Cleric's Wisdom modifier. Spent uses are regained upon finishing a long rest. Further levels in this subclass grant the Guided Strike Channel Divinity option that adds +10 to an attack roll, the War God's Blessing Channel Divinity option that lets the Cleric add +10 to an ally's attack roll within range, the ability to infuse weapon attacks with extra damage of the same type dealt by the weapon, and eventually, the ability to gain resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical attacks. The War Domain Cleric is the martial option for the Cleric, blending the line between Clerics and Paladins with a heavy emphasis on offensive weapon attacks and tanky heavy armor. While this subclass won't rival the power of a true Paladin, I would recommend people who like Paladins or fighters to give this subclass a try and see how you like it for yourselves. With all the class and subclass abilities explained, let's now look at how to build a Cleric if you want to try one for yourself. The Cleric can easily get pigeonholed into a traditional healer role, but the varied subclass options available at level 1 give us plenty of room to play around in with different roles. For this example, I'm going to build a level 1 Life Cleric, emphasizing healing spells, but still taking some offensive options to deal damage if none of my allies are getting hurt. For ability scores, my highest ability score should be Wisdom, to boost up my spell attack modifier, spell save DC, prepared spells, and ability uses for some subclass abilities. My second highest ability score can either be Strength or Constitution. Strength is important to have high to take full advantage of heavy armors and melee weapons, whereas Constitution boosts up my health and concentration saving throws. For my specific Cleric, I'd try to get my Strength up to 15 to be able to use plate armor, then get my Constitution as high as possible. The rest of the ability scores can be spread out as you see fit based on what you have available. After ability scores is health. To determine the cleric's starting health, take 8 and add your Constitution modifier to it. After health is equipment. Now, you do get some variety in these choices, so let's go through them here together. For my cleric, I'd want to take a mace, a good one-handed weapon that allows me to hold a shield in my other hand, chainmail, which I can use to get 16 armor class since I will be proficient with heavy armors thanks to the life domain subclass, a light crossbow and 20 bolts to give me a mundane ranged option if cantrip casting isn't available, an explorer's pack, which has more useful equipment for adventuring than the priest's pack, and a shield and a holy symbol. The shield can be wielded in one hand to add an extra +2 to my armor class, and the holy symbol acts as a spellcasting focus for my cleric spells. One of the fun things about the cleric is that their holy symbol can be adorned on their shield, meaning the shield can grant +2 to your armor class and be used as your spellcasting focus at the same time. With equipment done and dusted, let's take a look at the level 1 abilities a cleric needs to note down. At level 1, the cleric gains their spellcasting and chooses a divine domain. Let's run down spellcasting first, then add our divine domain on afterwards. For the examples we'll go through, let's assume our wisdom modifier at level 1 is +3. My spell attack modifier is just my proficiency bonus plus my wisdom modifier, and my spell save DC is 8 plus my proficiency bonus plus my wisdom modifier. So, with a wisdom modifier of +3 and a proficiency bonus of +2, my level 1 spell attack modifier would be +5, and my spell save DC would be 13. Now that we've got those listed, let's look at spells. At level 1, I know 3 cantrips and have 2 first level spell slots. However, I need to prepare the spells before I cast them, which is limited by my wisdom modifier plus my cleric level. With a +3 wisdom modifier at level 1, this means I can prepare 4 first level cleric spells. Now, I'd want to go over to the cleric's spell list and choose 3 cantrips to know and 4 first level spells to prepare. Since I'm going to be getting the Bless and Cure Wounds spells from my subclass option, I won't want to choose those. Instead, I'd take the Guidance, Light, and Spare the Dying cantrips, as well as the Detect Magic, Guiding Bolt, Healing Word, and Sanctuary spells. With my spells prepared, I'm now done with spellcasting. Remember that clerics can always change their prepared spells upon finishing a long rest, so you can always swap out your spells if what you chose isn't as useful as you thought it would be. With spellcasting done and dusted, now we just need to note down our subclass abilities. As I stated earlier, I already decided I'd want to choose the Life Cleric subclass, so let's go through what abilities that domain grants us. At level 1, this subclass gives me the Bless and Cure Wounds spells on my spell list as prepared spells, so I need to make sure to note those down. I'd also need to add my proficiency with heavy armor to my proficiencies on my character sheet, to prove that I can wear the chainmail that I took in my equipment. Lastly, I'd need to write down the Disciple of Life ability on my sheet, remembering that anytime I cast a leveled healing spell, the creature will also gain 2 plus the spell's level in extra hit points. At level 1, that's only going to be 3 extra hit points, but those 3 points can sometimes be the difference between life and death. With the subclass noted, our level 1 abilities are now done, and with all the ability scores, equipment, and level 1 abilities laid out, we have a level 1 cleric ready to go. And that is everything you need to know about the cleric class in D&D. A fantastic support option, the cleric has a surprising amount of versatility that can be a bit complex to a brand new player. However, the Cleric is definitely a class worth learning, as they are the go-to support option for any D&D party. Now, normally when I play casters, I tend to lean more towards the I cast Fireball types. But the last time I played a light Cleric, I actually had a really great time, because their built-in class lore helps a lot with creating interesting backstories and roleplay. But what do you all think? Is the Cleric the only choice when it comes to support casters? Or do they only work as a healer and not much else? Let me know in the comments below, or join us over on the Altrole Discord, which is linked in the description, to discuss it with the community. While you're there, feel free to say hi and check out our live courses that we run every week for free that cover any and everything you could possibly need to know to play D&D. If you want to help support the server and this channel, you can also check out our Ko-fi page in the description. We've almost reached the end of our classes that we can break down in this series, so next week we'll be breaking down the Ranger class as our final video in this series. Don't worry though, we have more content we're working on to continue helping you all learn more about D&D. But that is everything I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time, I appreciate all of you who support us here, and make sure to have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see all of you next time.